Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really glad to see folks trickling in from our growing community of practice. Welcome. We might have folks continue to trickle in as we go. This session is also being recorded. My name is Ali Gillespie, and I'm the Network Engagement Coordinator with the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative. On behalf of the RSRI, I'm so excited to welcome you to this first session of our new webinar and learning series, 12 Months, 12 Domains. This series is designed to take a deeper, more intentional look at the Self-Reliance Index, or the SRI, by focusing on one domain at a time. For those unfamiliar, the Self-Reliance Index is a measurement tool containing 12 domains that focuses on a refugee household's basic needs, resources, and sustainability, with a mind to understanding how self-reliant households are and how this shifts over time. Domains measure conditions and assets that increase the likelihood that refugee households will be able to continue meeting their needs in the future. If you're interested in learning more about the Self-Reliance Index, you can access resources on our website, or you can contact our RSRI Training and Technical Support Manager, Ned Meerdink. There are lots of ways we can support your application of the SRI and your programming, and we're really eager to help. So over the course of this year, each monthly webinar will spotlight one of the SRI's 12 domains. The goal is to move beyond high-level discussion and really dig into what each domain looks like in practice, what it means for program design, for policy, and for how we understand and support refugee self-reliance across different contexts. One of the core understandings of the SRI is that responses in all sectors can and should contribute to promoting self-reliance, and our domain by domain series in 2026 hopes to highlight that in detail. So throughout the series, you can expect focused discussions, practical insights and resources, expert perspectives, and real-world case studies from practitioners and members of the RSRI's broader community of practice and network. Together, these conversations are meant to support learning, reflection, and action, using the SRI not just as a measurement tool, but also as a framework for deeper understanding and more responsive programming. So we're kicking off the series today with a focus on housing and shelter and their role in advancing refugee self-reliance across diverse contexts, including resettlement settings, host country environments, and camp or camp-like settings. Within the SRI, the housing domain gathers information about refugees' households' access to adequate and safe shelter, as well as households' ability, where relevant, to pay rent. Safe, adequate, and affordable housing underpins so much of what makes self-reliance possible. It affects whether people can pursue and sustain livelihoods, access education and health services, achieve financial stability, maintain physical and mental well-being, and exercise agency and dignity in their daily lives. Shelter, and what represents shelter, which promotes self-reliance, is also a thematic area that can look very different depending on context. So it will be great to explore some of those differences this month and in this session. Housing, at the same time, can be both an outcome of self-reliance or a pathway toward it. This dual role raises important questions for programs and policies. How do we design housing and shelter interventions that support longer-term self-reliance? And how do we ensure that housing is meaningfully integrated with other sectors rather than treated in isolation? So this is exactly what today's webinar will explore. We will begin with a presentation from Lindsay Guerrero, Director of National Housing Strategy at Church World Service. Lindsay oversees refugee housing solutions, an initiative supporting resettlement agencies, NGOs, and refugees across the United States to expand access to affordable housing. She also co-chairs the Global Refugee Accommodation Working Group, or GROG, leading cross-sector coordination on housing challenges. With over 15 years of global experience, Lindsay is a strategic leader at the intersection of refugee resettlement, affordable housing, and humanitarian response. She brings deep expertise in policy, systems change, and multi-stakeholder collaboration, with field experience in Latin America and South Asia. Fluent in Spanish, Lindsay holds an MBA from UNC Chapel Hill and a steadfast commitment to equity and durable solutions. After Lindsay shares an overview of GROG and presents some global best practices, we'll move to our panel discussion, where we will hear panelists' insights from their work across different contexts, highlighting innovative programming approaches and policy efforts related to housing and shelter for displaced populations. And we have a really exciting panel lined up for today. So the first panelist I'd like to introduce is Mohammed Nababteh, a humanitarian and development professional with over 12 years of experience working in Jordan with refugee and host communities. Mohammed spent more than a decade with the Norwegian Refugee Council, holding leadership roles across shelter and education programs and leading multi-sectoral interventions supporting refugees and vulnerable Jordanians. His work has focused on access to safe housing, school rehabilitation, education in formal settings, and integrated approaches linking shelter, education, and protection to self-reliance outcomes. Mohammed currently serves as a protection project manager with CUPI, where he leads protection and case management programming and works closely with local community-based organizations to strengthen protection systems and promote dignity, resilience, and self-reliance. Next, please join me in welcoming Stephanie Acker, founder of Every Place, an initiative partnering with refugee-led and community-based organizations to reimagine shelters and shared spaces through beauty, dignity, and community-led design. She brings nearly 20 years of experience advancing refugee protection, rights, and belonging across local, national, and international contexts. Stephanie has led emergency shelter operations for the city of Boston, served as National Public Information Officer with the U.S. Office of Refugee Resettlement, and worked on refugee policy at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Her experience also includes roles with UNICEF, the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action, and academic appointments with the Migration Policy Center and Clark University's Integration and Belonging Hub. Our next panelist is Evie Long, Deputy Director of Housing at Church World Service, where she oversees national housing initiatives and refugee housing solutions. Her work focuses on advancing innovative housing pathways through technical assistance, training, capacity building, and partnerships across the CWS network. Evie brings over 10 years of experience supporting refugee and newcomer households with housing, employment, and case management. She leads resource development and housing program design, manages corporate housing partnerships, and is passionate about collaborative, locally driven solutions. Evie is bilingual in Spanish and English and has lived and worked in Honduras and Chile. And last but not least, our final panelist is Phyllis W.Y. Sang. Phyllis is a licensed architect with over 15 years of experience spanning commercial practice and humanitarian architecture. Based in Uganda, she currently serves as the creative director at Every Shelter, where she leads the design and implementation of an end-to-end housing framework within the Nakivale refugee settlement. Phyllis's work focuses on transitioning shelter from a one-time emergency product into a long-term evolutionary process. By integrating design, build, and supply pillars, Every Shelter develops systems such as the Pabora Day One Housing and the Model Village Cluster Living Pilot that fosters stability, economic agency, and a sense of belonging for displaced populations, directly linking housing stability to broader self-reliance outcomes like financial inclusion and social cohesion. Phyllis holds a master's degree in sustainable emergency architecture. We're very grateful to our panelists for sharing their time and expertise today, and to all of you for being part of this conversation. We encourage you to engage, reflect, and think about how the ideas shared today might apply to your own work and contexts. Some final housekeeping notes. Please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat box. We'll open that up for the audience to be able to respond, and add any questions that you have during the session to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Captions are available in multiple languages. To access them, turn to the Zoom menu on your screen, select Captions, and then select your speaking language. With that, I'm pleased to kick off our first 12 months, 12 domains webinar, and I will now turn it over to Lindsay for her presentation on the Global Refugee Accommodation Working Group. Over to you, Lindsay.
Thanks so much, Allie, and I'm honored to be with you all today. Yeah, so I thought I would start off with just sharing a bit about, the realities of housing right now. And as Allie mentioned, I co-chair the Global Refugee Accommodation Working Group. So the UN estimates that by 2030, 3 billion people, about 40%, UN Habitat estimates that by 2030, 3 billion people, about 40% of the world's population will need access to adequate housing. What this translates into is a demand for 96,000 new, affordable, and accessible housing units every day. This can be incredibly daunting, but we believe it's steps like conversations today, the Global Refugee Accommodation Working Group, among so many others, that are the necessary steps to start to promote change. What GROG is, right, the Global Refugee Accommodation Working Group is, it leads global cross-sector coordination, communication, and collaboration to identify and innovate opportunities to address refugee accommodation and housing challenges. So I thought what might be helpful is to share a bit of background of how we came to where we are today. And essentially, for those that are familiar, every year in June, it once was called the Annual Tripart Consultations on Resettlement, ATCR, and it has now been renamed to the Consultations on Resettlement and Complementary Pathways, CRCP. In 2023, Ireland co-chaired the annual tripartite consultations on resettlement, and really one of the key areas and challenges that was identified by various states, NGOs, and refugee groups was a shared challenge of housing for refugees in resettlement countries. So as a result, Church World Service had the opportunity to present a presentation on what we were doing in the U.S. framework and how that might translate. And my colleague Evie will be able to share a bit about some of the work on the U.S. side, but how some of these best practices and lessons learned could be translated to other countries, and we could better coordinate across countries and various intersections, right? And so Ireland, along with other NGO colleagues at Church World Service, agreed to be the inaugural co-chairs. And really, that was in 2023, and we publicly launched in 2024. Ireland co-chaired in those critical first 2 years of launch, and now CWS is the permanent co-chair of GROG. And achievements thus far is it is really becoming the leading platform for finding and reflecting on some of the most promising practices around one of the most intractable problems facing refugee resettlements all over the globe, which is access to safe, affordable, and decent housing. GROG is the only platform of its kind that we know of, and where it really uniquely brings together NGOs, international organizations, and private sector and academia. I wanted to highlight a few key achievements, and then for the latter half of the presentation, I'll briefly kind of walk you through some of the key things that you may be interested in on our website. But our flagship project that we're really proud of is we have developed and launched really this kind of authoritative country-specific housing policy source in a unique digital interactive journey format. So far, we have 2 countries up on the map, but our hope would be at some point be able to expand across the globe. We hold regular meetings featuring members from all different sectors and organize various webinars. Some of you may have attended our webinar last week, actually, which was really insightful and on the topic of housing challenges and solutions in the new international protection landscape, considering the whole of the route. And so what we really looked at that time was the major changes in the international protection system over the past several years and how that is impacting housing, and examining and hearing from practitioners that not just on final countries of resettlement, but also along the route and what housing looks like from transient housing to country of first asylum to a country where individuals may be resettled. So we're really expanding our scope as GROG has evolved since 2023 and have been able to present at several following consultations on resettlement and complementary pathways, and are able to really come together as a global community. So what does that look like ahead, right? Like what are we all gathered here? And we have this big task ahead of us of this is massive challenge to increasing capacity, right? And so a few priorities of GROG moving into this year and into the future is really continuing to foster this inclusion and participation from resettlement stakeholders across the globe, and being able to coordinate, right, and learn from one another. We also want to continue to be this digital space and in person as possible for knowledge exchange on housing, and being able to be kind of that go to place that folks can come to and find some um, areas of collaboration. And then really, as I kind of mentioned, the resettlement um, system is changing, right? And so how might we be able to kind of expand some of our scope and be able to address some of the real time challenges that we're experiencing? And so where do we go from here, right? We all, I think, are probably here because we understand that housing is a basic human right, and we know that the housing crisis impacts our ability to increase capacity to welcome more refugees. And so if this is interesting to you, you are welcome to complete our expression of interest. I can pop all of that in the chat, but we would very much love to have more folks join GROG and be able to be a part of this collaborative space. And so what I thought I could do for the remainder of the next couple minutes before we hand it over to the next presenter, and I can also pop in the chat several of these links that I've referenced, but just to briefly share our GROG website. Hopefully you can see my screen, but we have our official site, and on here it is, we're constantly expanding our website as well, but you'll be able to learn a bit more about everything that I just shared, who we are, our mission, our background, some of our achievements, solutions and models. We also want to be a space where if you're in a country and you're thinking through, hey, I had this really creative idea of host homes, right? Or I had this idea of how we might do adaptive reuse. Well, there's some countries that have done it, and some have done it well. Some have said, hey, we think this could work better if you adapted this, right? And so we want to be that space where you're able to learn from one another. And so we also welcome new solutions. If folks have solutions that they think should be up here for global use of others, absolutely, we could add those. So you can see here some solutions. And then, as I mentioned, we have this really interactive map that we've been able to put together. We have only a couple countries right now, and it's a point in time as well. But what it really does is the goal was to be able to kind of walk you through what resettlement and housing looks like in various countries. And so it kind of takes you through this digital interactive map, which folks can explore as they have time. And then lastly, we're in the process and regularly adding to this page as well of resources that highlight both refugee resettlement and housing and accommodations, and how that might be helpful to you all. So if you have interest in this, or you're interested in being a part of it, as I mentioned, we have this expression of interest that you can complete, and it would be lovely to get to know you. Without further ado, I know we have several amazing speakers today, but thank you so much, Ali, for allowing me to speak, and I'm really excited to learn from all the colleagues on the call. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for sharing more about GROG and the really collaborative and cross-context work that you do, as well as sharing some of those great resources on your website and your expression of interest. Everyone be on the lookout in the chat for some links on all of those. We'll also include these links in our recap email of this session. So definitely check out GROG and submit that expression of interest if you're interested in getting involved. Great. I'm so excited now to transition over to our panel discussion. So we'll get all of our panelists spotlighted and added into this space so you can see us all. Our first two questions will be round robin style. So I will call on each panelist to give us a brief 2-minute response for these first two questions before we dive a little bit deeper in today's topic. So I will go ahead and start with Mohammed. Um, would each panelist briefly tell us a bit about you and or your organization's work as it relates to refugee housing? Over to you, Mohammed.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Mohammed Nababte. I manage a project with Kupi in Jordan currently as a protection project manager, which target vulnerable Syrian refugees and Jordanian host community families in 3 locations in Jordan. The project itself like integrates case management, cash assistance, mental health and psychosocial support, and community system strengthen, like capacity building for the CBOs to improve the well-being, inclusion, and resilience. On the housing side, families receive cash for protection, cash for winterization, cash for education, helping them secure and maintain safe shelter while stabilizing their household income. Also, previously, during my work with the Norwegian Refugee Council on the shelter project, we focused on the shelter rehabilitation, cash for rent support, and also urban housing programs for both refugees and host communities. And this work spanned both emergency responses and medium-term solutions, ensuring safe, dignified living conditions and linking shelter support to other sectors like education, protection, and livelihoods. Across both organizations, which I currently work in COPI and the Norwegian Refugee Council, NRC, the focus has been not only on providing shelter and protection service, but on creating also pathways to self-reliance and longer-term stability for vulnerable household through also the working group, working with other NGOs, referral pathways, so we can support refugees and the Jordanian host community. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mohammed. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I am Stephanie, and I guess since we're talking about home, I'll tell you where I am. I was born and raised in Southern California, which should probably be obvious. I consider Boston home, but I am based in Florence, Italy, where I live with my family. And I have spent most of my career working either directly on home or housing or the concept of home. And I realized that actually half, like 12 years of those, have been physically in either like housing projects with migrants and refugees or physically in shelters. And it wasn't until later in my career that I had finally kind of understood that in those physical spaces, the role that beauty played. So I am the founder of Every Place, and we work to want to try to change the global response to refugees through beauty, which I know is not a word that you often hear in these settings. But hopefully that will continue to change. And so every place is kind of held up by 3 pillars. So we focus on the physical places where refugees live and how they transform those spaces using beauty to feel like home. And why do we do this? Because we think that every place deserves to feel like home, irrespective of where that is. And that beauty is this like central way that transforms just a basic shelter or transforms any place that you might not even want to be into something that feels like home where you can recover and rebuild. Practically, what this looks like is that we partner directly with locally based refugee-led organizations and mobilize funding, resources, training, and technical support so that they can implement their visions and ideas of how they want to reclaim the spaces that they're in. So that will be what I'm talking about. And while this is like practice-based work, this work comes from years of research that was done at Clark University's Integration and Belonging Homeground Lab in partnership with Dr. Devor Newmark. So I will hopefully get to share a bit about the research and the practice of what we're doing.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie, for sharing a bit more about Every Place. Over to you, Effie.
Hello, I'm Evie. Thanks again for the invite to get to talk today. I'm from Church World Service, CWS. We are one of the 8 national resettlement agencies in the United States. We've been operating and serving refugees and other newcomers and immigrants in the US and also globally for about 80 years now. This is our 80th year. Both through in the refugee space, both through private sponsorship and the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. CWS also may be familiar to a lot of you as it has historically operated the RSC in Africa, serving sub-Saharan Africa for refugee processing. So for those of you who are based on the continent, may recognize our name from that. We also lead our U.S. National Capacity Building Project, Refugee Housing Solutions, where we work to provide resources, training, capacity building, and opportunities for innovative and solution-centered partnerships for resettlement and housing stakeholders to increase access to affordable housing for refugee families and newcomers. We support local offices to find local housing solutions for newcomers and provide resources for newcomers and refugees themselves to help maintain stable housing and, to Stephanie's point, really find what is home. We're really working on long welcome. Context is changing a lot, and we're looking at how can we continue to serve and make sure that folks are in safe, dignified housing, even in contexts where international governments are less than friendly toward the work of welcome. This is something that CWS is very, very passionate about. And then we also work across local governments, trying to push refugee and newcomer friendly housing policies. For example, working with states like Michigan and Colorado, who created refugee housing subsidies for rental assistance, and really kind of working along these innovative projects and helping to kind of spread those best practices. That was, Michigan did it, and we talked a lot about it, and Colorado said, maybe we can do it. And they did. So really showing what is replicable within the United States, as well as looking at the long welcome and what can we do in the long term. We work on as many innovative solutions, shared housing like host homes, and down to looking towards home ownership for refugees who are in the United States and really looking for that self-reliance, generational wealth building as well. So I'm excited to talk to you all throughout the rest of the call. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Evie. And finally, over to you, Phyllis.
Hello, I'm Phyllis from Every Shelter. Every Shelter is a humanitarian design firm, and our focus is to help refugees create their homes. So instead of seeing shelter as a product or a product delivery, we try to create an environment where refugees could create their homes. And so our projects focus on 3 different areas, is design, build, and supply. Design is really about showing people what to build. We have design school that focus on human-centered design. Really, the goal is to help refugees, or to foster more creativity within the settlement, so that people could come up with creative and local solutions to address the shelter issues. We also publish a technical and design guide in that regard. And then build is we do a lot of training and shelter repair. Last year, we trained about 80 people in shelter repair and construction. We find that the quality of housing in the settlement is generally low because of the lack of skills and lack of like good accessibility to good materials. So we do all of shelter repair and then supply. We work with a lot of hardware store owners to make sure people be able to access quality tools and also materials. So these are our 3 areas of focus. Yeah, as mentioned before that I'm based in Uganda. Our projects are in Naki Valley right now. And Naki Valley is a refugee settlement with about 270,000 people. All of them are Congolese. Yeah, it's grown a lot in the last year. It's grown by almost 50,000 people last year. Yeah, so that's us.
Great. Thank you so much, Phyllis, and other panelists. And, before we deep dive into all of the wonderful approaches and solutions that you all have, we'll go through one more kind of quick round robin question, this time starting with Stephanie, to hear about, in the context where you work, what are right now the most significant housing related barriers that refugees face in progressing towards self-reliance? And we'll start with Stephanie.
Okay, thanks. So I think there's two. The first one Lindsay already mentioned is that there is just a lack of housing and a lack of quality housing. The amount that needs to be rebuilt is just astronomical, and that's not unique to refugees, but it does impact refugees because it just means that there isn't enough housing, and then it pits refugees against host country populations in a way that is then very unhelpful. But the biggest barrier that I want to highlight, I'm going to pick one because I feel like it's actually in our control as practitioners, is the concept of temporariness. It's a word I want to ban, except banning words is not something I generally support. And the reason is that because temporariness for policymakers, service providers, and for refugees, I think becomes an unhelpful framework. And often because it affects first shelter, first emergency shelter, first housing. And I feel like it becomes a cop out to be like, well, it's just temporary. And I'm guessing any of you on this call can relate in some ways if you've ever moved someplace just for an assignment, just for a grad school position, or you're just there temporarily. You think, I'm not going to invest in this place because I'm just here for a bit. I'm not going to hang up any decorations. I'm not going to be here. So this mindset that it's going to be temporary means that we ignore place. And all of the science shows that actually like the physical places where we are really matter. And so if we're ignoring those places or we're creating kind of a cop out of like, again, it doesn't really matter. It's just, it's temporary. That's really ultimately damaging. And we know from years and years now of data that actually, sadly, displacement is not going to be temporary and it's not going to be short term. So, by even having this mindset, we are ignoring what we know to be the very real realities of displacement. Tom Scott Smith, who is an architect, cites this statistic. It's unclear how it's calculated, but that an emergency shelter tent is designed for 1 year, right? Temporary, just temporary. We need like something fast right now, but it ends up being used for 17. And so I think we should come up with a different adjective that we just, irrespective of what the focus is or the design is, we need shelter and housing that is dignified, safe, therapeutic. And I think anytime that we're thinking in terms of timelines, it becomes damaging to everyone in the process, specifically the people who are living in places that weren't ever designed for to be lived in long term or short term.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie, for bringing up kind of the issue of temporality and how that affects housing. Next, we'll hear from Evie.
Yeah, I'm gonna highlight another aspect that I think we're especially seeing in the U.S. Uh, the lack of housing is apparent, and it's as Stephanie noted, it is affecting everyone. But one thing that I think is especially acutely affecting the refugee newcomer population in the U.S. is affordability. We've seen the housing crisis not change a lot in the US. There are some locations where there's more availability. We've seen local communities and governments respond and start building more housing. But we continue to have this issue where we have a surplus of what we call luxury housing in the US and a dearth of actual affordable housing. And so, although on paper it might look like there's lots of housing, the lowest income populations do not have an option because most of that available housing is in luxury. And so we're just continuing to see either luxury or market rate. And as we know, market rate is too expensive for a lot of folks in the US already. And so we're seeing this especially acute for new arrivals who are coming without resources, who are dependent, upon arrival on support from funding. And so that also ties into a lot of different things about source of income, what kind of funding is available, what a landlord will will accept. And so what happens is then the units that are affordable may then have quality and safety issues, right? And so, okay, this is affordable, but it's not in good condition because these are slumlords who are willing to rent, but they're willing to rent as is and are not going to respond. And so you have this issue of we actually cannot put folks into this housing because it's too expensive and it's a disservice to put someone in a housing that they're not going to be able to afford and be evicted from a year later. But also we can't put folks we can't have folks move into housing that is a safety hazard and a health hazard. So we see this especially true in urban areas or what we might call like destination locations where there may be really high populations where their family, in like California, Florida, Dallas, and other large Texas cities, as well as the Northeast. We're just seeing the affordability. Although traditionally a place where that has resettled many refugees in the United States, it's becoming almost unlivable as far as cost is concerned.
Great. Thank you, Evie, for highlighting the issues of affordability and how that ties in with safety and other aspects in the US context. Next, we'll hear from Phyllis.
Yeah, for us is I would say capital capacity and supply chain. Capital, yeah, funding, it's very low right now. So new refugees arriving in Uganda, they only get two tarps, maybe poles, and a little bit of cash-based assistance. Um, yeah, that's very that's below minimum. Um, and like I mentioned, there are a lot of Congolese that there was a high influx of Congolese, and a lot of them a single mother. So imagine, yeah, arriving in the settlement, giving only tarps and be expected to build a home for themselves. So there's definitely like technical capacity, but also it's capacity as a new refugee having to find food and water, feed the kids, and also build a home for themselves. So that's, yeah, that's a lot. And then supply chain is just accessibility. Again, there's no refugees doesn't have access to financial products, even if they want to borrow some money to build a home. There's nothing available. So in the end, even if hardware stores is able to to provide construction materials, people can buy them. They just don't have the funds. So those are the three things.
Great. Thank you, Phyllis. And then last, we'll hear from Mohammed.
Thank you, everyone. So for Jordan context, which focusing on the Syrian crisis and the non-Syrian also refugees, and within the also the Jordanian host community, the most significant housing-related barriers, also the access and the availability. So limited affordable unit, affordable rent in urban areas, coupled with eligibility restrictions for certain cash or housing programs, which is like targeting the most vulnerable household, for example, female head of household, number of family members, people with disability, elderly, children, health conditions, protection concerns, eviction cases. Also, the affordability, as high rent force families to spend the majority of their income on shelter, limiting their ability to meet their other essential needs. The other also factor, the quality and safety. Like many units are substandard or unsafe with poor insulation, overcrowding, or basic safety hazards. And the last thing, which is the most significant, the funding and policy shifts, like reduce donor funding to Jordan, the inflation and the policy constraints increase vulnerability, which is often like pushing families toward negative coping strategies like frequent relocation or sharing overcrowded spaces. It goes also to child labor, early marriage, also reducing funding, also pushed Syrian refugees going back to Syria without any secure shelter inside Syria. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mohammed. So it sounds like, you're all coming from different contexts. We have camp-based settings, resettlement settings, countries of asylum in urban areas. But it sounds like there's a few themes that are really coming up in terms of issues around affordability, safety, quality of housing, and how that ties in with other aspects like financial inclusion that contribute to refugee self-reliance. So now that we've kind of established some of the challenges in this space, I'd like to move on to some of the solutions and approaches that you're seeing that really work. So for the next question, I'd like to start with Phyllis this time, and we'll hear from two speakers, 4 minutes each on this one. Phyllis, can you describe a housing or shelter approach in your context that supports longer-term self-reliance beyond initial placement or emergency assistance?
Yeah, from what we have observed, I think a phased approach is appropriate for at least for our setting. Like Stephanie has mentioned before, a lot of the times people start with something very temporary. They might be able to build a tent, and then as they get settled, the next thing for them is finding a way to obtain a durable home. In our context, is making bricks and then building a home. And so, yeah, what we have found is that the best approach is to come alongside them and then provide the technical assistance that they need. Um, yeah, last year we observed that people immediately wanted to start making bricks, but they're not able to because they can't even afford a $3 brick mold to do that. So we started a program that is a brick mold lending program. New arrivals could get a brick mold for free, so they have it consistently for them to make bricks. And yeah, we find that we're able to shorten people's time frame from a tent moving into a durable home by at least 2 or 3 months. So then after that, people having their main house, and then they start thinking about expanding, adding on to it to include livestock or yeah, any other type of livelihood opportunities. And so we find that yeah, a phased approach is more appropriate, especially in the funding environment right now. We cannot provide someone with like a dream home from the first day, from day one in the settlement, but we could help them along the way. So another aspect is basically removing obstacles for refugees so that they could create their homes. Yeah, either removing obstacles or removing bottlenecks. So if they need the tools, we could provide the tools, the technical skills, and also the just working alongside them. I think that's the most appropriate approach we have found.
Great. Thank you, Phyllis, for sharing some of the phased steps that you take to really support that longer term um, self-reliance. And now we'll hear from Evie on the same question.
Yeah, I really want to highlight the importance of I'm gonna call it education within this space, and specifically not education necessarily to refugee populations, but education to the greater community and where they live about um, refugees, who they are, and what they bring to the table, what they bring to communities. Um, I say this because I think we can be given all the right tools and have all of the impetus and ready to make things right for ourselves. But if if the people with the power do not give us the opportunity, it doesn't matter, right? We see this anywhere where there's bias or where there's blockages. And so one of the ways where we've seen really lasting change, where the opportunities are actually there, um, is in making sure that our communities are welcoming, and especially the housing stakeholder community. And so at CWS and RHS, we do so much work. We have a whole project called the Trusted Housing Partners Project, where all we do is we talk to landlords and property management companies and say, you have been misinformed. We don't say it like that, but we kind of talk with them around, let's really talk about what renting to a newly arrived refugee or a newcomer looks like. You might think it's this, it's really not that. You might think it's this bad for business, it actually is good for business. And so we do a lot of education around that to help open doors. Now, that's a long-term project of educating, getting folks in the door, getting people to say, oh, you know what, maybe I had some false, uh, uh, ideas about what this would look like, and then continuing to work on making sure that then on the other side, we're working alongside families to make sure they know their housing rights and expectations of living in the US, and knowing that every family is different. So much of what we work with landlords is every family is different, and helping dispel this idea that renting to someone who's a former refugee or just arrived is any bigger a risk than renting to some random person that you don't know, right? We, in the US context, we're like, it's like beating a drum over and over again, to talk about like vetting things because everybody's worried if you can't pass a background check. And so talking through that, and helping understand that while you might notice this population of your tenants more because they're different than what you're used to, there's not going to be that much of a different experience with them percentage wise to your other demographic of tenants, and that it's the same amount of risk that you take by being a landlord, right? So this is a big educating thing of reminding folks that if you're in the landlord business, there's a risk to it. You might have a tenant that's not going to pay rent, but this population is not any different, and working through ways that they can support them in a way, in taking alternate documentation, alternate sources of income, things like that. We really try and phase it in a way that's saying, hey, this is a benefit. And also just citing, the importance of immigration and newcomers and refugees and communities when it comes to the housing market. We are in the US, we're in for a very rude awakening in 20 years as a backlash of all of the anti-immigration things that are happening right now. It's going to affect the housing market, and it's going to affect that. So even from a business perspective, we try and speak their language a little bit, and then do a lot of education and working with newcomer communities on advocacy and telling their stories about home. So we do workshops, to identify things, getting folks who are willing to tell their stories and ready to advocate in front of our, congressmen for advocacy about why our refugee communities in the US need to be included in the housing conversation, because these are continue to be constituents, and kind of work through that. So education is a really, really key point there. But again, in kind of a more holistic way. So we do a lot of work with that.
Great. Thank you, Evie. Thank you for highlighting the ways that long-term self-reliance is not just, the responsibility of people, but that it's actually facilitated by the stakeholders around new arrivals, and that it's the system really that needs to kind of change and experience this education to really facilitate self-reliance for families. Great. So now we'll hear from Stephanie and Mohammed on our next question, which is how does housing stability or instability or any other kind of aspect of housing affect outcomes in other self-reliance domains such as employment, health and well-being, financial inclusion, safety, or social cohesion? So we'll hear from Stephanie first.
Great. Thanks, Allie. Okay, so obviously I'm biased because I'm on this panel, but housing is the foundation for the other domains. I know every other sector or domain that comes in the rest of the series is going to argue for their role in self-reliance, but I want to think that there's a reason that this is the first one. And that is because housing does come first. And so I will say this is right, like proven by evidence. And I'll draw from a moment just from homelessness response, which is obviously very, very different than refugee response, but there's just some more data on it. And I think there are some parallels to learn. And so just as like context, right? Historically, homelessness in most countries was dealt with like, okay, right, there's kind of staircase model. You come and we just get you off the street. We just get you any housing. And then if you're kind of like good, you learn how to follow the rules, then we'll like get you the next piece. And then if you like, okay, can eventually find a job, we'll get you the next one. And it's just this really slow process. And it was in the late 1990s that practitioners in New York were like, they were working with really individuals who had really significant co-occurring disabilities. And they're like, we are institutionalizing people. They will never be independent. They will never get out of homelessness. We are trapping them in this scenario. We have to change this. We have to like flip this model on its head. So you are probably familiar with this, but I'll just show um, kind of a picture here of, right, like the kind of initial model is like, right, you gradually kind of get there and then eventually you get to housing. And eventually the housing first model was like, no, 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 like housing is a right and is the platform for all these other things. And we're just going to take you straight from you don't have a home, we're going to put you in a home. And why is that? It is because housing affects all these other domains. And it goes in two ways that I'll share. So one is that housing both prevents harm. So one of the reasons why housing first eventually became adopted worldwide was because they realized like, oh, this saves money. It is more cost effective to invest in housing than to invest in emergency response, part because emergency response, if anyone has worked in crisis response or in a shelter, it's really, really expensive and often more expensive than actual kind of like building of homes. But it also is because not having safe, stable housing is damaging to people, and we don't take that into account. And so, what they learned was like, oh, if people are in housing, they're not using emergency health services as much. They are not dependent on as much financial aid because they have a stable place. And so, one, it's preventing harm. People who don't have stable housing, it's like the average is they live at least 10 years less. And so we have to factor that into like self-reliance, that one, housing prevents the damage that occurs on all sorts of levels. But then two, it helps with self-reliance. And so you can imagine like how do you find a job if you can't decide when you come and go? How do you, keep your health if you can't reliably have a like quiet place to sleep during the hours you need to sleep? How do you keep up, if you have specific dietary needs and you can't cook? How do you feel connected to people if there's not a safe space? So all of the domains like rest on housing. And then in the work that every place does, we're specifically focused on like, and then how does actually making not just any old home, how does actually making that home look or feel beautiful? How does that matter? And that actually has impacts on so many domains of self-reliance. And I'll just highlight a few. So one is that having a home is a piece of self-reliance, right? It is having agency. You have agency over your own space. And that matters so much when like refugees are just stripped of agency, right? They can't control the war that broke out. They can't control if the government is going to give them rights. And so any act of agency is so important. And having your own space that you can modify helps, right? To be like, I have agency. I can do this next thing. I can do it. Phil said, I'm going to now make the bricks. I'm going to do something else. It's a way of um, gaining kind of confidence. And then it also, there's all these studies about how physical place, transforming place impacts mental health. And so being able to transform your own space, being able to have it reflect your old home, those physical actions, they affect your sense of hope, they influence your sense of safety, and all of those really matter to achieve those outcomes of self-reliance. So I'll stop there. You're
Wonderful.
probably
Thank
going
you,
to cut me off
Stephanie.
soon.
Next, we'll hear from Mohammed. Same question.
Thank you. So for Jordan context, housing stability is a critical enabler of self-reliance outcome across multiple domains, while housing instability often undermines progress in others. And during my experience with the Norwegian Refugee Council, Jordan context, stable and adequate housing provides a foundation that allows families to engage consistently in education, livelihood, community life. When households are not facing eviction threats, overcrowding, or unsafe living conditions, children are more likely to attend school. For example, caregivers can follow up on education and protection services. And also adults can seek and maintain employment without frequent disruption. Housing instability, such as insecure tenure, high rent burden, or substandard shelter, forces families into short-term survival strategies that negatively affect self-reliance. This may include withdrawing children from school, increased child labor, early marriage, or reliance on negative coping mechanism. Also, I want to add on the poor shelter condition also have direct impacts on health and psychosocial well-being, increasing stress, illness, and protection risks, which in return reduce the household capacity to participate in livelihoods or community-based initiative. From a programmatic perspective, I believe shelter stability strengthens the impact of other sectors by reducing repeated humanitarian assistance and enabling continuity of services and improving the effectiveness of cash, education, and livelihood intervention. Also, housing therefore functions not only as a basic need, but as a multiplier for longer term resilience, dignity, and social inclusion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie and Mohammed, for highlighting just the many different domains and aspects of refugee self-reliance that housing really, influences and impacts as a foundation for, so many different areas of well-being as well. Great. So now we will hear from Phyllis and Stephanie. First with Phyllis, could you share a story that illustrates how stable housing enabled a refugee or household to make progress towards self-reliance?
Yeah, last year we did a survey with our program participants who are in the Brick Mold program. One of the survey question was, how do you think your life would change after moving into a brick home? And 80% mentioned safety as the number one difference, which really makes sense as like this group of people are still living in tent. So imagine a single mother living in tent, not being able to lock your door at night when there's so many gender-based violence cases. And so safety is definitely one. And then the second most mentioned things that would be people could start thinking about more about livelihood. They were starting to think about like what kind of business they could start, getting livestock, getting animals. So those are the two things. But then also for the group of people that are in the brick home right now, um, the yeah, it's the low quality construction also is a poverty trap. Another survey that we've done, like a lot of people spend as much as 50% of their household income in repairing home. So yeah, like the other two panelists has mentioned, if you're spending 50% of your income in repairing homes, you can't send kids to school, you're not getting enough to eat. A lot of people have to skip meals every day in order to maintain a home. So yeah, those are the two stories or two examples I could think of that really affect self-reliance.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Phyllis. If that evaluation of that programming is published anywhere, if you have any reports, I know I would love to read, and I'm sure people in our network would love to learn more about that program as well. Now we'll turn to Stephanie. Tell us a story about housing.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you a study also, but I will tell two stories also. So I'll get them in my 4 minutes. So I think the study that I know has been mentioned here that the Juan Pablo Franco from the Bluemont Group did before, and I know there is another study kind of being underway, but I just think it so clearly shows. So they tracked newly arrived Venezuelans to Colombia, and some individuals were able to get short-term rental support that allowed them to just have a safe space to live for a set amount of time. It wasn't forever, right? It wasn't like a permanent subsidy. And then they compared it to people who didn't have just that rental subsidy. And the outcomes like are not surprising to me, but they're very striking, right? It's like at the end of the time period, which again was not a huge amount of time, the people who were able to have stable housing, they scored higher on the self-reliance index, they scored higher on just having peace of mind, and they had like double the income. And the reason was because it was like, I think kind of to Phyllis's point of like, I'm not worried about my safety. I'm not thinking about, oh my gosh, what's next? So I'm able to actually plan better. I'm able to make progress on these other things. And um, right, so in some ways, it's like if you're constantly worried about where is next, your nervous system is activated. You're like in fight or flight, and you can't think critically. You can't worry about much else because your basic safety is not there. So I want to highlight one story of um, an immigrant to the US who I worked with. And she was in shelter for a while. And because she didn't have an authorized status, she was not able to get into most subsidized housing programs in the US. You are banned if you do not have certain things. So it took her a long time and she really felt trapped. She came to go to the university. She had all these dreams and she really was just like frozen during that time that she was in shelter. And she seemed kind of like a shell of a person. And finally, there was a spot that opened up. There are some like state funded programs, and she got into that. And I ran into her on the street years later. And I mean, just like a different person, right? Um, Felt safe, had her own place, was able to find ways to make money, make a living. It's like she could, again, kind of like similarly, her nervous system finally was like, okay, I am safe and I have a place. And now I can think about and maybe think about those dreams that I had before. I have a place where I could invite people over. And the last one I'll share is like hopefully just the introduction to a story that I can share later. But we have been working with RLOs in Kakuma. And one of the things they shared is kind of like, well, no one here ever intended this to be home. And one of the things they said they wanted to track, they want to be able to share is what do people have a greater sense of home after kind of doing the project that they're planning? And, because they said they're like, we have neighbors, they've lived here for 30 years. They still wouldn't say it's home because no one planned for it to be home or no one um, thought that it was home, but we want to help try to make this feel like a home and see how that changes, see how when people are engaged in transforming their environment, how it changes that. So I hope in the future to have the end part of that story, but I'll just share the beginning as a cliffhanger.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. We'll be waiting for the end to that story as well. And also, I just wanted to highlight, I posted a link in the chat, the study that Stephanie was referring to from Bluemont in Colombia regarding an evaluation of a rental assistance program. That study used the Self-Reliance Index and found, really great results. So I shared that. We also have a blog post coming out later this week on the RSRI blog from Juan Pablo Franco from Bluemont on that study as well. So be on the lookout for that. Next, we'll, kind of zoom out from some of the, more on the ground stories and approaches and hear from Evie and Mohammed on what changes are needed in the policy and or funding landscapes to strengthen housing as a pathway to refugee self-reliance. So Evie, we'll start with you.
Yeah, great question. There's so many things. CWS, we work a lot on and have historically on advocacy and policy in general for refugees and newcomers. And we were the first resettlement agency to have a specific housing advocacy staff member that focused on talking to our congressional members and politicians and all of the people who get to vote on our behalves on these things about how we continue to include these populations. And so I think one of the big things, and we've talked about this is maybe again continuing to beat the drum, but building more housing, and not just housing, but affordable housing. That's in the major policy landscape in the US, but globally is how do we make it easier to build more safe, sustainable, affordable housing? That is the number one thing. And so that looks very differently in different contexts. In the US, a lot of it looks on like changing zoning things that in localities and making it easier to build affordable starter homes, multifamily units, things like that, lots of different types of housing as well. I think that's a really key thing, especially for refugee self-reliance. One of the big barriers that we see in the US is that immigrant and refugee families are much larger than US born families. And so there sometimes is actually just not housing available that have enough bedrooms for a family of 9. And so, a lot of the counseling that happens when we have really large families that arrive is right away we start talking about, we just need to get you to a point where you can buy your own house, because renting is always going to be more expensive for you, or impossible unless you find someone who's unless you're going to break code and have overcrowding and things like that. It's just really, really difficult. And so building more affordable starter homes that are bigger than a 2-bedroom. We love 2 bedrooms in the US. And so continuing to build larger homes, but also to build more affordable starter homes that are smaller, right? That aren't these giant mansions that we really don't need to have in the US and sprawling. Um, I think another big one that we've worked on with Refugee Housing Solution with our federal partners is state and federal recognition of refugees in the US and their security clearances status in the US for specifically housing providers. During the previous administration, we made really awesome strides to actually have a landlord letter that was signed off by 4 different federal agencies, including HUD, the Department of Homeland Security, USCIS, the Department of Health and Human Services, that basically said, these are who refugees are. They've gone through all of these background checks. You can rent to them. They don't need to have their social security. That was a huge stride and could be really, really helpful when working with folks who just didn't want to rent to newly arrived refugees. We still have that. We still try and utilize it. Depending how savvy a landlord is, they might feel like, I don't know if this is still signed off on, but it was really helpful in those contexts. And then I would say, in the context of the US and potentially in other resettlement countries, source of income laws. So housing rights that basically say it doesn't matter where their money's coming from. If they have money to give you for rent, you have to accept it. It doesn't matter if it's from a housing voucher. It doesn't matter if it is funding that a resettlement agent or someone else is paying for their first month's rent. You can't deny them based on this. This is really important in a lot of contexts, right? I have friends who came to the US as refugees who or special immigrant visa holders who came even with savings, 6 months worth of rent that they're able to pay up front. Oh, but you don't have all of these other things that we want, and so we won't rent to you. And so that type of stuff that just really doesn't make sense. So really working on, yeah, building more affordable starter homes, and just investing in building more housing, and then ensuring that refugees and newcomers are being afforded the same rights, even if it looks different and folks just aren't as familiar with the system. Again, which goes back to my point of needing better education, because when you're working with mom and pop landlords, sometimes they just don't know. When you're working with really large property management companies, they know and they don't want to do it, usually. And so it's just that education of reminding folks, this is things that you can and cannot get away with, and again, the other side of it of like, we're not just trying to come down as a hammer, but like trying to actually change the perspective of like, this is good for your business. This is good for our communities. This is good for our country. We're not asking you to do something that, I mean, there's a lot of studies, right, on our newcomer populations, and in the US, the richness
I
of
might
our
pause
community.
you here.
Yeah,
You could
you're
just
good.
finish with that.
Yep, yeah. So anyways,
Great.
just kind of knowing that, and continuing that education as well.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for highlighting kind of the policy and funding aspects in terms of bringing in the private sector and changing national systems around this as well. Great. Over to you, Mohammed, to hear about changes in policy and or funding landscapes that are needed in your context.
So for Jordan, like building shelters for refugees not applicable, unfortunately. So we need to look into other solutions to work with refugees, mainly with the Syrian refugees and other nationality. So I believe like first, improving access to secure and longer term rental arrangement would greatly enhance housing stability. Policies that encourage or formalize medium-term leases for refugees, supported by dispute resolution mechanism and incentives for landlord would reduce eviction risks and allow households to plan, invest in education, and pursue livelihoods more sustainably. Second, greater flexibility in shelter assistance modality, including recognition of integrated approaches such as rehabilitation for rent. Uh, um, so, for example, during my previous experience with NRC, we used to work on a flex modality or flex package, which include shelter rehabilitation, free rent period, and rent support with a lease agreement between the landlord and the tenant. So allowing shelter rehabilitation investment to translate into rent-free or reduced rent period, strengthen 10-year security while benefiting both tenants and landlord. It's like win-win situation. Third, strong policy alignment between housing and livelihood is critical. Like enable refugees to access lawful income generating opportunity without risking housing security, such as simplifying work permits for refugees so they can work and reducing also geographic or sector restrictions. So it needs like more advocacy from all UN NGOs, talking with the government, talking with the international donors, because this will increase the sustainability of housing outcome by ensuring families that can meet rental costs over time. Finally, predictable and multi-year funding framework for shelter and cash assistance would allow agencies and NGOs to move beyond short-term rental support toward stabilization and self-reliance oriented housing solutions. So longer planning horizons are essential for linking housing with education, protection, and livelihood pathways. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mohammed. And thanks for highlighting how it's not just housing policy that needs to change, but also something like access to work permits and how these policies can really work in tandem to promote self-reliance across the different domains. Wonderful. So that was kind of most of the questions that we had for our panelists. If anyone in the audience wants to add questions to the Q&A box, we'll now kind of open it up for your questions to our panelists. I'll add Lindsay back in as well in case anyone has questions on GROG or how to get involved there. I do see we have one question in the Q&A box, so we'll start with that. The question is for Evie, and it's regarding housing supply and affordability in the US. I think you've touched on some of this already, but I'll go ahead and read kind of the full list of questions in case there's anything else you want to add here. How can refugee resettlement services support the creation of more housing in American cities, considering laws like the EQA in California, developers' complaints about the inability to build? Many believe that increasing market rate supply will de facto increase affordability by increasing supply. What are most effective approaches to increase supply, and are there examples of adaptive reuse and resi conversions of any building type for refugees?
Great questions. I think I maybe disagree with the idea that increasing market rate will de facto increase affordability. We already have an increase of luxury housing. I know that you're saying that's what folks are saying. So I would say specifically talking about increasing the supply of housing, affordable housing for low to moderate income individuals is very important, because what happens is this tiered approach where if you're looking for housing, you're always going to look for the best deal, right? That includes very wealthy people. And so what ends up happening is the very wealthy, if they can find a really nice place for lower, they're going to go for that one and they're going to be more qualified. And so the landlord's going to rent to them. So now that one is not available to someone who actually can't afford the one above them. And so what it happens is it pushes everybody who's lower down to the bottom, and all of a sudden there's not housing. So even folks who are middle class are, trying to, meet that 30% of our income ratio or lower. And so they may be in houses that low to moderate income folks or super or very, very low income people can afford that, especially the nice ones, the ones that are in good quality, and they're always going to beat them out on a rental application. If they have, right, if they can show it, they're always going to beat them out. That's why the affordable housing landscape exists, that you have to be below this certain, making this much of the AMI in your area, so that folks don't get pushed out and pushed into homelessness simply because they are cannot be competitive right now. And as we talked about, how can people possibly get to a point where they're competitive if they don't have stable housing? And so I think the advocacy efforts and talking with your decision makers in your state and your local communities about why it's important to invest in affordable housing that has income limits, um, and why that's so important, because that is where the dearth is in the United States. We're seeing more and more market rate. We're seeing more. Still have in my city, we have empty luxury apartments that are sold for $500,000, $700,000. Nobody that actually lives here and works here and makes a wage here can actually afford those. And so that is a really important thing, is really talking with them about doing that. And then coupling that again with those conversations about zoning, conversations about public transportation. Like these are all encompassing as well. Public transportation, because the complaint is, well, where are people going to park? Well, where are people going to, right? And so talking about, well, what are the other systems that we have to invest in to make sure that this, is an ecosystem that people can actually live in.
Great. Thank you for sharing that, Evie. We don't have additional questions from the audience right now. So if you do have questions, please add them. But I'll go ahead and ask a question. This is open to any panelists. Also, I think Mohammed needs to jump off. So thank you, Mohammed, for joining us.
Thank you.
We
Thank
really
you,
appreciate
everyone. Thank you for your time. I learned a lot. It was a pleasure.
it. We'll continue on for the next 10 or so minutes. So to any panelist, what to you represents innovation in shelter response?
I'll share just some learnings, and I wear a few hats, so I popped some refugee housing solutions resources as well here. I think innovation can often be a overwhelming word to some, right? It seems like, oh my goodness, I'm not that creative, I'm not that innovative, but it is actually quite an inclusive term. Like it could be you have this out of the box solution that no one has thought of before on how you might create more sustainable and affordable housing, which is wonderful. It could also be adapting other solutions and learning from different fields and sectors, right? So I think going back to what Stephanie highlighted is housing is critical for every other aspect of self-reliance and self-sufficiency. So telling that narrative is critical. And then also realizing, okay, so what are other sectors doing? What are other folks doing for really creative ways to house folks? And how might we adapt some of those best practices? And maybe it is innovative, or maybe it's adapting what others have done well, right? And so I would say that not to be afraid of the term innovative, definitely welcomes creativity, definitely welcomes a lot of design thinking, but it could also be something quite simple that maybe no one has realized could work. And so bringing that to the table, I think, is what I would encourage folks, that there's nothing too big, but also sometimes the most simple solutions work as well.
Awesome.
Can I come
Stephanie?
in on that? Yeah. Well, I think just to state the obvious, I think innovative strategies that really carry across is what people who are living there are doing. And they are the ones who often know or who are often thinking. But in this book, I'm trying to Design to Live. I was just going to get it off my shelf. That was run out of MIT. They, documented all the ways that residents were transforming the camp, and they were so innovative, right? But if it's like, oh, this layout sucks that you you made, we're going to make it make sense. We're going to refine this. So I feel like anything I've seen that is innovative is largely coming from the people who are living there and giving them the freedom to make those innovations and modifications and trying wherever we can just to push for the freedom to do that because so often it's like a policy thing that can span the spectrum. Even, in the US, it's like if you live in an apartment, there is no painting, there is no modifying. But the more that we can let people be innovative, they they will be, and they'll make their housing better.
Great. Yes. Thank you for highlighting how the innovation is really coming from the grassroots, from the people who are living in the spaces and experiencing that. Phyllis, I know you've talked a bit about kind of the brick mold model that every shelter has been using. Are there any other things that represent innovation to you in shelter response from your context and work?
Yeah, I'll talk about another project of ours. It's also a phased approach to housing, one that is called Pabora, that you mentioned. Pabora means better roof in Swahili. The reason for that is that it's initially an A-frame structure that is used as a tent, but could later be adopted or adapted into a roof for a brick home. Um, so yeah, going back to the phased analogy, that it started with a temporary shelter, then people themselves make the bricks, we assist them whenever they need, and then we provide the technical capability or assistance for them to build the home, set the foundation, and then do more, do more things that require construction skills. But then also, yeah, getting them involved in that progress. So we've been, yeah, doing that projects for a few months, and we're starting to see, yeah, how cooperative could work together, make bricks for each other, and then also converting homes for each other until everybody is done within that circle.
Yeah, thank you for sharing a bit more about that. Um, Great. Next question is kind of, we've heard from Phyllis on the camp context and kind of the different phases there. We've heard from Evie about some of the issues in the US and Stephanie from working with local community-based organizations. I'm wondering if anyone wants to respond to this, what housing strategies or principles do you think are the most transferable across different contexts? So thinking kind of beyond what's happening in your context, what can be transferred to other settings? And this will be our final question as well. Okay, go ahead,
I'll just,
Evie.
yeah, I'll just quickly say, and you'll hear me repeat this a million times, but I do think the work of education and making sure that folks are aware of their housing rights, responsibilities, options, is incredibly important. I think we run into this in a lot of different contexts where, especially if you're, in the context of displacement, folks become a newcomer in many different scenarios. And so you're constantly having to learn these new contexts. And I mean, I'm people who have lived in my context for 30 years don't understand our housing system or what their rights or responsibilities are. And so I think continuing to not make assumptions and also compounding with the understanding that if you've experienced trauma, you need to hear about things more often. You need to learn about them more often because trauma inhibits our ability to learn and remember things. And so I do think that continuing education, empowerment of folks of making sure you actually have those tools is so important. And so I think, through what Phyllis is doing and giving people the actual tools and continuing, I think that is transferable across contexts. It will look different in each one, but I really think that's a really key one of making sure folks know what their options are. Because if for so many folks it's just, well, I didn't know that. Nobody ever told me that that was even an option. And if I don't have access and I don't know how to find that stuff out, then you're just kind of sitting, not being able to make even the smallest decision for yourself in a context where you have limited decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. So a focus on education, awareness of rights, regardless of context, is super important in terms of housing. Any other panelists want to take on this final question before I close our session?
I think I'll add that giving refugees options is very transferable. From what I observe in Uganda and other places too, usually refugees are assigned housing, assigned a plot of land, given this amount of money, and without really any options to like the alternative ways of being a homeowner. If they want to build, if they want to rent, um, family sizes, the size of houses, or yeah, or design. I think just giving refugees the option and autonomy to decide for themselves is very, very important.
Thank you for adding that. Stephanie, over to you.
Yeah, I'll come in that I think what's transferable is that, again, it's going to sound so obvious when I say this, but housing is in a place. It is a physical thing. And so always keeping that in mind that whatever the physical place is, whether it's again temporary, whatever context, that taking that into account, that like the science just shows across the board that whatever place we are in is going to impact us. And so really whatever, even if you're not in the housing sector, but you're in another sector, knowing that that physical environment is going to impact all sorts of other things. Um, Again, maybe you can't even change it, but making sure that we're not blind to that, like we are impacted by our physical our physical places, and just not forgetting that because it's really important and it impacts all of the housing that gets built, how we move. But we've kind of ignored the fact that we are physical humans who live in physical places.
Absolutely. Thank you for these kind of final points about some things we can transfer across contexts. And thank you to all our wonderful presenters for the valuable insights that you've shared today. Before formally closing our session, I'd like to share a quick 30-second survey for the audience. If you're able to fill out our survey and just give your thoughts on this session, 30 seconds, your feedback will really help us to improve future webinars as part of the RSRI's 12 months, 12 domains COP learning series. So just to highlight some key takeaways from this event, we talked about the connection of housing and shelter with many different domains of self-reliance, with livelihoods, with food, with social cohesion, and so many different other kind of areas that this affects, mental health and well-being. We talked about some differences in context in terms of the timing of shelters, the materials and quality of shelters, as well as things such as affordability, agency for people to be able to choose the shelter that they have that really will enable their household to thrive in that space. We talked about different implications for programming, innovative ideas such as a brick mold phased model, or working with landlords to educate them on different communities and what that looks like in practice. And we've talked about different policies that need to change as well with national systems and engaging with the private sector. And then I know a lot of the panelists have shared different resources and opportunities for continued learning, for partnerships. I know every place is looking for local organizations to partner with. And we have every shelter as well and refugee housing solutions. There's so many different ways to get involved, no matter what sector you're part of. So thank you to our panelists for all of your amazing insights. The RSRI will share out this recording and more housing resources via our Community of Practice newsletter. So be sure to sign up for our COP newsletter on our website if you have not already. And now I just want to end with something shared by Bob Anderson, who's an RSRI COP member on our RSRI Hub platform. Bob said that in Kenya, there's a Gen Z saying, "Bila safe space, life ni ngumu," meaning without a safe place, life becomes impossible. So I'll just end with that. Thank you for joining. Thank you again to the panelists, and we look forward to seeing you all for next month's webinar, which will be focused on the relationship between food security and self-reliance. So be on the lookout for more on that. And thanks everyone for joining. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.